All right, today we are looking at Archaic Greece and Sparta. Well, in fact, we're finishing up Archaic Greece since we already got through a lot of that in class before we switched over to the online. So we're just going to revisit the main key points of that transition and the changes that took place, and then we're going to look at Sparta today. So with the Archaic period, the main developments, and the first one that there's two that really emerge right off the bat: writing and then long distance trade. But they already had during the Dark Ages internal trade, but you have the reemergence of long distance trade. With writing, right, we looked at the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the importance that those played with the major themes, and how those major themes become, especially we'll see in the classical period with Athens, very central to their views and ideas. And then, of course, Hesiod's Works and Days, which we looked at Pandora's Box, and how that shaped actually both of these, both the Odyssey and the Iliad. The Pandora's Box shaped the role of women and the view of women in Greece. And both of these fit within and solidified some key components. We're going to come back to looking at women when we talk about Athens, because of course, when you're talking about classical Greece, so the archaic part we're looking at here is before classical period, and then Sparta transitions into the classical period. And then when we talk about Athens, we're going to be looking at the transition to democracy and the classical period. That's a classical period as well. But so when you're talking about the classical period, and we generalize things with Greece, it pretty much applies to everywhere else but Sparta. Sparta, we'll see, is very unique. And doesn't follow the pattern of everywhere else in Greece. So just keep that in mind. If I'm generalizing about Greece, which I won't be doing too much here because we're either talking about the Archaic or just Sparta, but as we continue through the lectures, as I generalize about Greece, that's everywhere but Sparta. You should just assume for the most part that Sparta is different. There are a few areas where they overlap, and certainly they're going to have the gods and a few other things that are the same, but their cultural practices and structure of society are very, very different from everywhere else. And so that you just don't want to include Sparta in your generalizations of Greece for the most part. So what trade brings to the table, long distance trade, is of course an increase in wealth, and an increase in wealth brings an increase in population. And these things are both important because it's going to create issues that is going to lead to colonization. And what happens with that, and what we looked at with the population increases in the areas that they were settled during the Archaic, well, during the Dark Ages period, and then at the beginning of the Archaic period, you were limited in your overall land mass. And as wealth increases and population increases, one of the problems that happens is that you have problems with property. And the problems with property have to do with their laws of inheritance, and specifically that all boys ended up with equal share of land. And this creates problems when you look at just a few generations, right? And I drew that diagram before, but just to reiterate, right? If you have a plot of land, so this is the land here, that's owned by the father, once he dies, and let's say he has two sons, well, then this land gets split in half, right? One son, one son. And then if let's say they each have two sons, the land gets split in half again, and that this eventually becomes not capable of providing for survival. So, with the increase of wealth and long distance trade, people looked to colonize to find new space. They wanted more land, more opportunities for, again, trade. This goes both ways. Trade both influenced colonization, and colonization continued to utilize trade. The shift with colonization then leads to the development of the polis, or city-state. And the city-states are incredibly important because now you have a couple things that happen with that. One is that you're going to have a change in government structure, and also a new type of identity. During the Dark Ages, your identity wasn't wrapped around like an individual state. And so, for example, this it definitely impacted the idea of warfare and its structure. With the idea that only people who fought in wars were nobility. And the poor tended to stay out of it. And they fought not for, state, city-state, but rather individual wealth and glory. And we saw this reinforced in the Iliad when it was talked about quite a bit. But with the development of the polis or city-state, you now have a new identity where you are Athenian or Spartan or Corinthian, right? And so on and so on. And so you identify with the city-state, and that's going to change the structure of wanting to be involved in politics, and as well as fighting and defending the state. So we're going to look at, there's a couple more that all interconnect within that structure. The next one then is the development of the Hoplite Soldier. And the Hoplite Soldier comes about, again, if you go all the way up to increase of wealth and trade, this, along with the development of the polis and city-state, help create the Hoplite Soldier. Hoplite Soldiers were very much defined by their armor and weapons. Why nobility were the ones that largely fought before is that equipment that you needed for battle was too expensive. And the only people who could afford it were the nobility. And so they were the ones that fought during the Dark Ages. Well, with the development of trade, long distance trade, and increase in wealth, this became cheaper. So that began. The average person could afford armor. Now that the average person could afford armor, this allowed for individual citizens, normal citizens, to be able to be soldiers. And then because they identified as an Athenian or a Spartan or whatever city-state they're from, they wanted to fight. So there was now a desire and ability to fight. The distinctive nature of the Hoplite soldier was that you had a large round shield and spear. Now they had other equipment as well. They had a sword, and then you had the breastplate shin guards, and helmet as kind of the main things that way. But that shield and spear were definitely the key characteristics. Now this gets connected to what was called the Phalanx Formation. And the Phalanx Formation was a new type of formation that utilized the Hoplite Soldier. And how it worked is that if these were the soldiers, you lined up in a row and then 8 or more people deep. Right, I won't do all 8 here, but as you get right that way. Then, as the people stood, we'll go with my awesome stick figure drawings here. If you had the Hoplite Soldier that had their spear, and then in the other hand they had their shield, right? And he's happy he has a shield. The next person standing over with a spear would also hold his shield. And so the idea was that the shield covered half of one person and half of the other. And so you formed a wall of shields. Shield wall. All right, and that was something that was very different. The traditional type of fighting was individual soldiers fighting, and everyone in the army, you just run up and attack. The type of shield. Now, the importance of this shield were that these were very heavy duty, which was important because if you had a weak shield, the Phalanx Formation wouldn't hold. So most people during this time had shields that were round or rectangular, and they were lighter though. They were not as heavy. These were very large, very heavy shields because they had to be able to hold the line. And then spears were not uncommon either. So it's not so much that this round shield and spear were new technology, if you will. Rather, the way that they created the shield was new. It was much heavier. It was much sturdier. But then the Phalanx Formation really made the Hoplite Soldier, and some of this stuff was lighter than other types of equipment. The shield was definitely that heavy component of it. So then when the individual soldiers just were part of the other army, right? So this is the Phalanx Formation. These were other armies. When they would attack, they would just be running from all areas to go. Whereas the Phalanx Formation worked as a unit. And this was important because then they could hold the line as the people crashed into them to attack. And then by holding it, you would have all these people behind that would push back and hold this front line against the attackers. Then they would push together forward with their shield, and when that pushed these attackers back, they stabbed with the spear. And then you put the shield back, and then you pushed, stab, and then slowly moved your way forward into the army. Eventually, this spear, this always broke down, right? So this worked great, but it did eventually break down, and then you would either throw your spear and or get rid of it, and then you switch to your sword, and then that became more individual fighting. But the idea is that the Phalanx Formation was supposed to hold out as long as possible, in an organized fashion that kept people protected, right? The shield wall kept people protected and was a super effective, cohesive fighting unit against this individual attack. And it was incredibly effective. It was not only used by the Greeks, the Spartans, and here's one where the Spartans were the same. The Spartans were hoplite soldiers as well. They used them, and the Phalanx Formation, just like everyone else in Greece. The difference were that the Spartans were professional soldiers, so they practiced it more. But the Athenians and others used the Hoplites and Phalanx Formation as well. And then Alexander the Great is going to adapt this, and then even the Roman army is going to adapt a version of this structure because it's so effective in protecting soldiers and fighting, compared to this. This is definitely the traditional style of fighting in the past. So this helped Greece continue to expand and colonize, and just be extremely good and effective soldiers in the process. Now, with the Hoplite Soldiers, this and the development of the polis, right? So with the combination of those two things, you get a change in government structure that emerges, in part because you now have the Hoplite soldiers, which were the common men. If you were a beggar and didn't have a house, then you wouldn't be a Hoplite soldier. But if you had any type of farm at all, you were a Hoplite soldier, because the equipment was now cheap enough to purchase. They hung the shield and the spear on their wall, again, except for the Spartans, and then you take it down when you fought, and then you put it back up and went back to your farming or whatever else you did in between. So because you now have an identity, right, if we're looking at what causes this change, an identity of a city-state and being a part of that, and the common man fighting for that city-state, there was a desire to participate in the government. Before, in the Dark Ages, we'll put that up again with that. The Dark Age government was very simplistic. You had the king and you had nobility. And their argument for why that was all you needed was that the king, ruled, and then the nobility, because they were the ones that fought, they had a right to help rule the government. Now that you had, like I said, more people, they wanted a larger participation and a larger stay in that process. So this is what it changed to, and we'll look at each section. You had an archon who was the head of the state, and this person was elected into that position, right? So you get rid of kings with this change. And then you had the military commander, who was obviously responsible for the military, but did have some say in the government structure. Next, you had magistrates. Magistrates did the day-to-day aspects of running a government or state, right? Making sure whatever affairs and stuff were in place. And then you had the council, which is really what the nobility had been. They elected magistrates. They worked on laws, things like that. And then lastly, you had the General Assembly. Now this whole thing is new. The General Assembly, though, is where all male citizens, and usually in most city-states 18 years or older, they were the ones that could participate. And what you did is you voted, yes or no on laws. So it's not a huge role, but it is a role that didn't exist before. These ones here were all still nobility. So you still were somewhat limited in that, because the majority of positions were nobility. But again, the key being that you now have elected positions, and you had one position that all male citizens could participate in. And we'll see when we look at Athens, we're going to look at how from this archaic government, it slowly shifts to a democratic system. Because again, the Spartans are not going to move to a democratic system. But Athens is going to, and it's a continued adaptation from the archaic period. Because you had so many of nobility, there were occasional, actually we'll keep this in with changes in government here. Because you had so much nobility, there was a potential for abuse, right? Because only the General Assembly could vote yes or no. But if the nobility got frustrated with how they were voting, there wasn't out of mind that they could just say, you know what, forget it, we're not going to follow what you said, and the nobility start to disrupt and take away any participation of the common man in the government. What happened then, and this was a natural thing, this was not something that was set up as a rule of law. It actually ended up coming out organically, which is really crazy to think about, as far as that it wasn't like, okay, we need to have these tyrants to be a check and balance. No, it was an organic thing that emerged. So tyrannos actually means lord or leader. Tyrant is the derivative of that, and they functioned as a natural check and balance. You know what's funny with the word, right, is if Tyrannosaurus, right, Tyrannosaurus Rex, Tyrannus is lord or leader, Rex is king in Latin. So you've got lord, leader, or let's say lord king, the dinosaur, right? Lord King Lizard is basically what the name of Tyrannosaurus Rex means. So yeah, Lord Lizard King. So he was a natural check and balance. Tyrants would then, so they were there for when abuse by the nobility happened in government. And it had to be something that was usually consistent and happened more than just one small time. They would take over. They gained their power from the populace, right? They were almost always, I think they were always nobility themselves. So they still were in that, but because they had the supporting of the people, they could take over. And then the tyrants, they basically, the archaic government stopped temporarily, and they were in charge. From this, they usually exiled problematic nobility. So those that were being abusive of their power. This could also lead to confiscation of land, which would go to the people. And they also focused on a lot of increase in building projects. And beautification of the city, education, and cleaning up the city. Most of the time, the tyrants did a good job and made things better. Now, the goal was that once a system was, let's say, safe again, they were supposed to unofficially, again, this wasn't an official thing, but unofficially they were supposed to restore the archaic government. So then you went back to an archon and structure. If you failed to do so, So let's say you decided you wanted to just stay in power longer, or you wanted to make it a kingship and give it to your son. This almost always ended in death or exile for the tyrant. The few times that tyrants tried to hang on to the power longer than they needed to, they were overthrown and assassinated or exiled. So it functioned as a check and balance on the tyrants too, by the populace naturally just overthrowing and getting rid of them, rather than allowing them to eradicate the archaic government, if you will. So it really was a perfect check and balance. And tyrannos or tyrant was not a negative word during this period. It became negative in the classical period in Athens when they became a democracy, because when they shift to a democracy, then a tyrant is actually oppressive. Right here, the tyrant is getting rid of the oppressive nobility and fixing things and restoring order so that the common people maintain their say. When you have a democracy and everyone in Athens, for example, has a say, if a tyrant comes in, then they limit participation and equality and say in the government. So there is a fundamental shift in Greek's view of tyrant from where it's just simply meant lord or leader and was generally seen as a positive thing to something that was seen as a very negative word. And that definitely has impacted our culture to this day. We see the word tyrant as a negative, and you can see that in the American Revolution and in language and text about kings. Tyrant is a negative thing. Well, we definitely got that negative view of the word tyrant from the Greeks during the classical period, but here it wasn't a negative thing. So these are the major changes that took place in the Archaic period, from the Dark Ages, and how the government and structure of society changed. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Sparta first. With this, so this is kind of how, like I said, the Archaic period. This is how people lived, how Greece was structured. Then you're going to have the shift to the classical period of Greece. And in the classical period of Greece, right, the two main powerhouses were Sparta and Athens. And it's interesting to look at because they go in completely different directions. So we're going to examine that. Today we're going to do Sparta. Next one we'll look at is Athens. And not only recognizing that they become two significant powerhouses in Greece, but do so in a very different way. So with Sparta then, so have Athens there, but we're looking here just at Sparta. It was located on the Peloponnese, which was a larger landmass than Attica with Athens. And this was significant in their development of expansion rather than colonization, right? So we'll see Sparta is going to increase in size due to expansion, and this is also going to influence the fact of that they were a land power, where we'll see when we talk about Athens, they became a naval power, and that definitely has impact on colonization versus expansion. Land expansion and taking over the Peloponnesus. They believe that Sparta emerged from a group of major Dorian tribes. Now, this is not 100% certain, but what happened is they think that the major Dorian tribes, they ended up merging together. And then from that, they think about 5 major tribes, right? Then those became the Spartans. The political structure in Sparta was very different than what we just saw with the Archaic and what we'll see with how that archaic government shifts during the Athens and into democracy. What you had was a dual kingship. And think that the reason dual kingship happened is because when the merge of these Dorian tribes took place, that there were two major powers within the 5 tribes, and so they agreed to have a dual kingship. The benefits of a dual kingship, right, have to do with that one can stay home and one can go to battle, so that you always are protected. Of course, it also keeps for the lineage, and if one dies, there's no question of people taking over, or arguing that that there's no actual appropriate king, and so then you have succession wars and things like that. Dual kingship is unique, and part of the reason is it doesn't usually work, because one king either decides to take power for themselves and get rid of the other king, or just take advantage of it when the king dies, or they end up bickering and fighting, and it becomes an unequal distribution of power. However, in Sparta, we're going to look at and see that their culture and structure in Sparta was Sparta before everything else. And because their culture focused and created an emphasis on Sparta over everything, dual kingship worked for them, because you didn't have a king that took their individual needs and desires for power and put it above Sparta's well-being. But again, dual kingship is something that is rare, because it doesn't usually work. The rest of their government is that they had a council of elders or aristocrats, and for this it was very limited. It was made up of 28 men, and you had to be 60 years or older. And then you had the General Assembly, which functioned much like with the Council of Elders, right? They did the laws and structure of society, making sure it worked. The General Assembly voted, right, on things. Here you had to be all of these had to be Spartan, but you had to be 30 years or older. All Spartan men that were 30 years or older could be in the General Assembly, but only 28 men could be in there. Now, you had other smaller positions. But that was the main structure of the government itself. If you're looking at other government positions, the most known and probably involved one were the Ephors. The Ephors were not part of the actual structure of functioning government of laws and working with the king and creating policy, but they were kind of like the police force. And you were picked to be within this position to manage the people and make sure that they followed what they were supposed to do, and that they, followed the laws and structure of Sparta. Now, for their social structure, this was also unique. Sparta, just because you lived in Sparta, didn't make you a Spartan. There were Spartans in Sparta, and they were the elite class, but there was a lot of specific rules and structure to this. So you were born Spartan if both parents were Spartan, and both parents had to be Spartan, not just one. They were the soldier class. For all male Spartans were soldiers unless there was some physical reason you couldn't be. And then they were the small percentage of the population. They definitely functioned like the nobility in some ways, and in other ways not, but we'll look at that. They were the only ones that had full citizenship and rights. And this will be problematic for them. We'll look and see, because they were so small within that. And then women played an important role. Women Spartans played an important role. Now, they weren't official soldiers, but we will come back and we'll look at that. And of course, the biggest thing with that is that they were the ones that provided the birth of Spartan children. Only with Spartan women could you have Spartan children. The next group were the Okoye, and it's believed that they were probably distant cousins to the Spartans, and that they were the first to be conquered in expansion, which benefited them because they had more freedom than we'll see the last group has, and really not even class. This was a caste system. So what's the difference between a class system and a caste system? In a class system, it's based on economics, and you can move up or down based on your money and wealth. Caste system, you're born into by birth and you stay there. And that is, you were a Spartan, you were always a Spartan. You were a Paraquoy, you were always a Paraquoy. You could not be a Spartan. You didn't become a Helot. Helot, we'll see, which is the third one we'll talk about in just a minute. Same thing. You were a Helot, you were born a Helot. You could not become anything else. So Spartan society was very much a caste-based system. So they enjoyed local autonomy in society in Sparta. They didn't have, we'll see, they weren't serfs or slaves, but did not have full citizenship. Again, only the Spartans could have full citizenship. They had like half citizenship. They tended to be, they could help serve the Spartan army, sometimes as support systems, sometimes as just the carriers of the shields, but they were subject to Spartan supervision. They were more, though, merchants, artisans, and any kind, so any type of pottery, cultural production, literature, except for there's a very slim amount of actual Spartan literature. We're going to look at a couple of them. Tools, things that you needed, clothing, right? They were tailors, blacksmiths. That was their main role within Spartan society. The last group were the Helots. Now the Helots emerged from, there were two wars. They were called Mezzanine Wars because it was an invasion into Messina. And the first, here we go. The first Mezzanine War was that they conquered the people. And these people that they conquered, they became Helots. And we'll talk about the second Mezzanine War in just a minute. The Helots were serfs. And they were serfs rather than slaves because they were tied to the land. They were farmers, and they were there to provide the food for the Spartans. The reason for this is that when we look at the structure of the Spartan men, they all were training and living in the barracks and fighting all of the time. And so the Spartan state, gave land and a house to Spartan men when they turned 18. And this was their income. The Spartan economy was different if you were a Paraquoy, because you had a slightly different economy. But for Spartans, it was meant to be as egalitarian as possible. all Spartan men got a plot of land and a house, and then then Helots. Helots were given with the plot of land, and the Helots then were the ones that farmed for you while you were gone fighting. Right, your wife and children for a certain point, depending on if they were a boy or a girl, lived in the home. But you were away, either in the barracks or fighting. You rarely lived at home as a Spartan soldier. Therefore, the Helots and what the state gave you for land and house became your income for survival. And then, the food and everything else could be traded to the merchants, to the Okoye, for other types of goods. But Spartans actively shunned excessive wealth. And felt that all Spartans should be relatively equal in wealth and structure. So the Spartans were definitely better off than the Okoye and the Helots. But again, the Okoye had a kind of different economic structure and had that autonomy within their own trading and development. And then the Helots were not well off at all. They were very much serfs who were treated very, very poorly throughout Spartan history. So what happens when we look at the next aspect of Spartan education and training, in order to understand how it got to be the way it did, you have to look at what took place with the Second Mezzanine War. So the Helots got tired of being serfs, and they revolted. So this was a Helot revolt. They ended up having the aid of the king of Argos, which was a city-state, and their king. So Argos helped them fight. They almost won. They were at there were no walls in Sparta, which showcases Spartan supremacy in as soldiers and in war. But they were, figuratively, they were at the gates of Sparta. And unfortunately, what happened is the king of Argos died. And this created a tailspin, which allowed Sparta to actually come out victorious. However, this shaped Spartan society. There became a fundamental fear of rebellion and overthrow. And the idea was for Sparta never again. So the king Lycurgus, they created new laws, new education and training, and a new kind of ethos around the warrior mentality. Now, they were always warriors, right? I don't want you to think that meant that they weren't before. But it became far more rigid and far more strict and crazy. And we'll look at the structure of training and what that meant. And that happened because of these changes. So what we're going to look at, we're going to look at a couple sources, as well as we're going to watch this clip, and then we'll talk about and break down what training looked like for both boys and girls for part of it, and then what it looked like for boys. So first we're going to watch a clip from 300. Now, a lot of 300 was not accurate, so don't think that this means all of 300 was true. This opening scene, though, does a good job of giving a snippet of what Spartan society became like after the Second Mezzanine War. So we're going to watch that, and then we're going to look at two sources that talk about kind of the value and structure of Spartan society. No, don't skip all the way to there. Hang on. I decided to jump to the end. Let's try again.
When the boy was born.
And I just turned off. Sorry. Let's try that again. Oh, good. Of course, that's going to do that. Right. There we go. Okay, let's try again here. I can do this. Here we go.
When the boy was born, like all Spartans, he was inspected. If he'd been small or puny, or sickly or misshapen, he would have been discarded. From the time he could stand, he was baptized in the fire of combat. Taught never to retreat, never to surrender. Taught that death on the battlefield in service to Sparta was the greatest glory he could achieve in his life. At age 7, as is customary in Sparta, the boy was taken from his mother and plunged into a world of violence. Manufactured by 300 years of Spartan warrior society to create the finest soldiers the world has ever known. The Okoye, as it's called, forces the boy to fight, starves them, forces them to steal, and if necessary, to kill. By rod and lash, the boy was punished, taught to show no pain, no mercy, constantly tested, tossed into the wild, left to pit his wits and will against nature's fury. It was his initiation, his time in the wild, for he would return to his people a Spartan, or not at all.
Okay, then it's going to go to not realistic here. So we'll stop there. There were not mythically large werewolf-looking beings, but all the other stuff that was listed there was accurate. And so we're going to look at some of the sources and expand on that, and then kind of make out a list of the different stages in the training itself. All right, so the first one that we're going to look at, and this packet, this is the primary source packet for you I gave you. We're going to be coming back to it again when we look at Athens. So this has stuff with Athens as well, which is why I'm scrolling through several of these. The first one I want to look at is actually the Spartan Creed. This one is really good for showing the Spartan warrior ethos and ideals that got incorporated into it. And it's one of the few, again, the Laws and Customs of Sparta was written about the customs. But this is one of the few actual Spartan literature that was created. Again, most Spartans did not spend their time writing anything. They spent time training and fighting. But this was one that did. So we're going to look at this because it is really important to understanding their kind of mentality and structure with it. So this first paragraph here is actually looking at, saying how would you judge a man, right? What is their way of knowing if they're quality, essentially. And so he says all the things he wouldn't take into account, right? I would not say anything for a man, nor take account of him for any speed of his feet or wrestling skill he might have. So speed and wrestling, not important. Not if he had the size of Cyclops. Now this paragraph has a lot of Greek myth in it, that they're comparing to all of these well-known at the time Greek mythical characters that exemplified the specific ideas of whatever he's showing. So in this case, size for Cyclops, right? Cyclops was, they were giants. They had one eye. We talked about the Cyclops with the Odyssey with Odysseus. So even if they were the size of Cyclops, which would have been the biggest, that's not it, right? Or the strength to go with the Cyclops. Nope. Not if he could outrun Boreas, the north wind of Thrace. So again, not even if he were faster than what was seen as the fastest thing, which was Boreas, nor not if he was as handsome and gracefully formed as Tithnos. So again, these are the epitome of these things, the epitome of size, strength, speed, handsomeness, and gracefulness. Not if he had more riches than Midas. Midas, right, is the one with the golden touch. Everything he touched turned to gold. Or Cranaeus too. Not if he were more of a king than Tantalid Pelops, or had the power of speech and persuasion of Adrastos. So again, each one of these people are these mythical stories of people were the epitome of these characteristics. And not if he had all the splendors except for a fighting spirit, right? So what is it that the Spartans judged as the character and nature of man? A fighting spirit. And then it goes in to describe what is a fighting spirit, right? And so then we get to see the description here of what a fighting spirit is. For no man ever proves himself a good man in war unless he can endure to face the blood and the slaughter, go close against the enemy, and fight with his hands. Here is courage, mankind's finest possession. Here is the noblest prize that a young man can endeavor to win, and it is a good thing his city and all the people share with him when a man plants his feet and stands in the foremost spears relentlessly, all thought of foul flight completely forgotten, and has well trained his heart to be steadfast and to endure, and with words encourages the man who is stationed beside him. So planting your feet and standing in the front of the Phalanx Formation, and they would plant their feet and hold the shield as all the soldiers were running into them. That should be the mental image you have of that, right? So one who plants their feet, stands on the front of the Phalanx Formation, doesn't think about fleeing, steadfast, and encourages the man next to him. Here is a man who proves himself to be valiant in war. With a sudden rush, he turns to flight the rugged battalions of the enemy and sustains the beating waves of assault. And so that's the fighting spirit. And then it goes into here about death for Sparta. With a sudden rush, he turns to... Oh, wait, we said that one right? Sorry. And he who so falls among the champions and loses his sweet life, so blessing with honor his city, his father, and all his people, with wounds in his chest where the spear that he was facing has transfixed that massive guard of his shield and gone through his breastplate as well. Why, such a man is lamented alike by the young and the elders, and all his city goes into mourning, and grieves for his loss. His tomb is pointed to with pride, and so are his children and his children's children, and afterwards all the race that is his. His shining glory is never forgotten. His name is remembered, and he becomes an immortal. This is one of the themes we talked about in the Odyssey and Iliad. So here is a similarity that the Spartans had with others, that they definitely took some of those themes. Not all women, their view of women was different. But the importance of being remembered, and that your memory to be remembered, that's how you became immortal. That was one of the themes that we talked about. And though he lies under the ground, when one who was a brave man has been killed by the furious war god, standing his ground and fighting hard for his children and land. So this is that death for the glory of Sparta. And in fact, they had a saying, which was, come back with your shield or on it. And the idea was, the shield was heavy, and they actually kind of wore it like a backpack when they marched. And so if you came back with your shield, you were successful in battle. If you came back on it, it was you were dead and you were being carried, right? They'd use the shield sometimes to carry the bodies of the dead. And the belief was, right, if you came back without your shield, that's because you dropped it to flee. Because when people fled, the shield was really a heavy burden to run with. And so you would drop your shield and take off. So if you came back with your shield, it was because you were successful in battle, or you came back on your shield. So you either were successful in battle or you died for Sparta. That was the value. The Athenians had a slightly different saying. Better to drop your shield and run away and live to fight another day. So very different mentality and ethos about that. The Athenians were more like, yeah, let's not sacrifice ourselves for a lost cause. Yeah, you want to be honorable, you want to be courageous, but at the same time, why sacrifice yourself when you can live to fight another day? Whereas Sparta, it's come back with your shield or on it. Now, if it ended here, this could be problematic because there's so much emphasis on death. It does talk about the courage of fighting, but it glorifies death. And when you have societies that only glorify death, that does create issues. The best example of that are the Vikings and Valhalla. And the Vikings believed that the only way to get to Valhalla, which was like the good afterlife, was to die a warrior's death in battle. So the reality is that if you lived to an old age, it was almost a shame because you had failed to get into Valhalla. So they would actually send out old men who were ready to die onto the battlefield at the front lines so they could be killed in battle so they could go to Valhalla. And so it created this kind of sense of shame around surviving and potentially being a really good warrior. Now, Sparta does not end that way. We have this last paragraph, right? But if he escapes the doom of death, the destroyer of bodies, and wins his battles and bright renown for the work of his spear, all men give place to him alike, the youth and the elders, and much joy comes his way before he goes down to the dead. Aging, he has reputation among his citizens. No one tries to interfere with his honors or all he deserves. All men withdraw before his presence and yield their seats to him. Thus a man should endeavor to reach this high place of courage with all his heart, and so try and never be backward in war. So they did have, they celebrated old age. It's why in their government structure, right, that we looked at, you had the Council of Elders, which were, you had to be 60 years or older. And that was seen as an honor. It meant you were a really good soldier. And that because you'd won your battles and not died. And they did honor that. People who were older in age were revered in Spartan society. So a little bit more positive than the Vikings, who really didn't give credit for old age. Yes, it's glory to Sparta, death is glory to Sparta, but so is surviving, because that meant that you won your battles and you were an excellent warrior in the process. But so this is a really good, the Spartan Creed is a really good example to showcase that what is the value of man as a fighting spirit, this is what the fighting spirit is, and but also the glorification of surviving and being successful. Now, the second one I want to look at is Xenophon's Laws and Customs of Spartans. This was created by Lycurgus, who was the king at the time, and this was after the Helot revolt. These were changes that were made because of fear of rebellion and never wanting that to happen again. And their argument or rationalization is that Spartans had gotten too soft. And that is why the Helots almost won. And the Helots should never win. They definitely were they looked down upon the Helots. They didn't think highly of them. And so for the Helots to almost win was just unthinkable in that sense. And so this talks about the changes that were made in order to create a stronger Sparta that would, not get challenged and not lose control again. And so it goes through a variety of things. But we have, if we're looking at trying to pick out characteristics or structure of training, instead of softening their feet with shoes or sandal, his rule was to make them hardy through going barefoot. Right? He believed that this would enable him to scale heights more easily and clamber down precipices with less danger. With his feet trained, the young Spartan would leap and spring and run faster unshod than any other in an ordinary way, right? So these were all ideas of how to make you stronger in battle. So younger boys didn't wear shoes in order to get calluses on their feet, so that if your sandal broke during battle, you could continue on. Then they wore a single garment the whole year through, which would better prepare them to withstand the variations of heat and cold. It talks about messmates gather to the club meal with such moderate food to avoid bloating and yet not remain unacquainted with the pains of starvation. His belief was that such training in boyhood, they'd be better able when occasion demanded to continue toiling on with an empty stomach. So here, they weren't, when early training provided enough food, with the idea that you always a little hungry better, not a lack of clothes. These were the boys training. We'll make a list of this in a minute, but he imposed upon the bigger boys a special rule. In the very streets, they were to keep their two hands within the folds of their coat, and they were to walk in silence without turning their heads to gaze, now here, now there, but rather keep their eyes fixed upon the ground before them. And so it was meant to lack of distractions, but also show respect. Right, when it says, when Lycurgus first came to deal with the question, the Spartans, like the rest of the Hellenes, they used to mess privately at home. Tracing more than half the current problems to this custom, he was determined to drag his people out of holes and corners into broad daylight, and so he invented the public mess rooms. The Spartan men ate together. And the belief was then, right, that it made it so while they had enough food, so this is for the older men, not the boys that were training, it put a stop to all unnecessary drink and excessive food, because then you had to walk home when the meal was over, and a consequent anxiety not to be caught tripping under the influence of wine or excessive food, right? That was part of that aspect as well. You have that was talking about the idea of cowards and view of that, and basically you have this idea of public shame as a way to keep them training and in line. Then you had the cultivation of virtues even in old age with the Council of Elders, which we looked at with the government system. He talks about the king and the structure of the king, and then oaths and ephors, which we talked about, right, and making sure that people followed it. So it gives you a brief look into some of the structures that were going on there. Okay, so now we're going to break down the training into different categories. The first was birth, and we saw in the video, right, that all Spartans, including girls, so both boys and girls, were inspected at birth. And if they were seen as weakly or sick, they were killed. And the belief was that like early eugenics, essentially. You wanted strong Spartan babies, because strong Spartan babies became strong Spartan children and became strong Spartan peoples, soldiers and wives, which, you know, continued this cycle in that sense. And so, yeah, what the video showed is, yeah, they inspected them, and your first test as a Spartan was at birth. And if you were weakly or sick, then you were killed. We only know of one case of a Spartan parent that ran away from Sparta to save their child because they knew their baby would not pass inspection. The thing is, Spartan society is super fascinating, but when you really look at it, they basically are brainwashing their citizens, and it's brainwashed into a sense of violence, and lack of empathy for people. It's not, you wouldn't want this society today, as fascinating as it is, you wouldn't want to live in this type of society. Then from birth to 7 years, both boys and girls lived at home. And they were trained and educated by their mother. Both boys and girls had public education. I skipped one there in my numbering. Sorry about that. So girls were educated publicly as well, and they were trained by their mother. They lived at home. They were trained by their mother because their father was in the barracks and lived there. Now, at 7 years, 7 to 14 years, this is where it splits off. The girls continued to be trained at home, and the boys went to live in the barracks. And they would begin their military training at 7 years old. Lived barracks. Here the training was about survival. So this is what we looked at with the source with laws and customs. They were not trained in Hoplite Soldier or Phalanx Formation yet. They were too young. And instead, it was all tactics and things that was meant to prepare them to be able to survive. They wore almost no clothing. You didn't have no shoes. They were taught to fight, like fist fighting and stuff, but not with weapons. No weapons. Not yet. You did not get enough food. And the idea behind this, what we saw, right, that they would be accustomed. It was about survival. Are you strong enough to survive? And this will toughen you up so that you'll be a stronger, better soldier. They were encouraged to steal, but not get caught. And this was the idea of stealth, right? You had to be sneaky to steal and were right for spies or on missions and things like that. So if you got caught stealing, you were beaten. But if you were encouraged to steal as long as you didn't get caught. And then they lived in the barracks and worked in cohorts. And these cohorts, which were usually made up of the age group, these that's who you fought with for life. So there also was meant to be a sense of camaraderie, and that you had this group of boys that you knew from 7 on, that you trained with, that you suffered with, that you worked with and fought with, and all of that. Then at 14 to around 18 to 20 years, there are several things that happen with this one. So around puberty, which is around 14, this is when you had he went out into the wild. You had your initiation. And you went into the wild to survive. And if you came out, then you had this was the wilderness test. Right? And if you came out alive from this, and there were boys that died, then you had a public ceremony. That was the idea of that you were moving into manhood. This public ceremony was a test in itself, in many ways. So how it worked is that you we'll have the drawing for that. They had a temple up on a hill, and then you had a road through town, and you started here, and there were people, the townspeople, the Spartans, lined up on either side of the roadway, and the boy, and your goal was to make it to the temple. What they had when they lined up were sticks, and they beat you and hit you with the sticks. Now, I mean, it wasn't as hard as they possibly could, but you were getting hit with sticks all the way up to the temple. The goal was to survive to the temple. But there was a sense of showing your strength and understanding yourself. So you didn't want to run. You could, but then it would have looked bad. You wanted to walk at a pace that showed that you could take physical punishment, but also know yourself to know when to keep going at a pace that meant you wouldn't die. And there were boys that died in this ceremony because they waited too long and got beat too much, right? Because the idea, the longer it took and you made it, the more prestige you got. But you had to know your limits in yourself, because if you waited too long, you could end up dead. Now, after you passed this, then you were initiated in as a Spartan. You didn't have full rights and citizenship really till you were 18 or 20 years old. But then this began, after you passed this initiation, then you began your military training. So here is where you learned the Phalanx Formation, right? Weapons, tactics, and no more lack of food. You got clothes, shoes, and food. The survival training was over, right? So that wasn't, the issue was on the military training now. And being able to be, right, ultimately, the goal of an active warrior. Now, you did not fight yet. You were not a soldier in war. We'll put that there. Did not fight in battles. Oops, this is not with it. At 18 to 20 to we'll say 30 years, there were a couple of things that went on there. So when you were 18 to 20, then you became a full you were a Spartan soldier at 18 to 20. So now you could go into battle and could. This is when you were given your house, your plot of land, and the Helots. And you were encouraged to get married. Then the reason that they encourage you to get married at 18 to 20 once you're soldiers, because then you could have more Spartan children. There was always a super emphasis on producing Spartan babies, please. You did not live at home, though. You could not live at home. You still lived in the barracks until you were 30. It was a law. It was a requirement. So you were supposed to sneak back to home and visit your wife and children occasionally on your free time. But you lived, you ate, you fought, you trained with the soldiers in the barracks. You didn't live at home. You didn't eat at home. You were rarely at home other than to get married and produce children. But you didn't stay there, right? You might spend a night here and there, but mostly you slept, ate, and worked in the barracks until you were 30, right? At 30 then, that was a big transition. At 30, you could live at home. Although most Spartans, because they had lived most of their life in the barracks, still spent most of their time at the barracks. And now you could be on the General Assembly. Right, you were seen as a full Spartan citizen now. So it took a long time to really be a full Spartan citizen, although you were given a lot of prestige between 18 to 30 years. And then the only other one was at 60 years old, right, where you, here we'll put here, still spent most of the time at barracks. But you could eat and sleep and live at home if you wanted to. At 60-year-old, right, you were allowed to be part of the council of elders if there was space. And you often were retired by this point, which is why they moved to the council of elders. However, they often still helped train soldiers and the children. So your whole life as a boy to man in Sparta was focused on structure of fighting for Sparta, training, being that. That's why they were professional soldiers. It's why they were so good at being hoplite soldiers, because the Athenians were hoplite soldiers too. The Spartans were just super good at it because they were their job was a soldier. Their whole life was a soldier and was focused and centered around that. All right, lastly, we're going to look at Spartan women. Women had a lot of freedom in Sparta, way more than we'll see in Athens and everywhere else in Greece. Now, this was not because of some egalitarian belief that women were equal to men. This was because the men were not around, right? They lived in the barracks for most of their life, and also because of childbirth. The belief was that strong Spartan women had strong Spartan babies. Now, it wasn't just that, because of course, the men not being around, women formed their own communities and lives with other women. And because there weren't that, it was still patriarchal. So that is important to notice with it, is that it was a patriarchal society. The men were in charge. They had it was, the best rules for them. But because of this unique situation, women were able to somewhat subvert that in the process. And because there was such an emphasis on what women produced of children, Spartan children, they were looked on favorably and allowed to have a lot of freedom. They could freely interact with men and society and the public right? We'll see Athenian women were not. Athenian women were not allowed to go outside without a male escort, and they were not allowed to participate in a lot of things in Athenian society, like the Olympic Games, plays, just most of society. Women were educated, right? We talked about with the girls. They had public education, and were often taught to read and write, along with some history, which was a huge thing because, again, Athenian women and other Greek women were not. They were encouraged to train in weapons and wrestling, and they wrestled men too, because, again, this was strength. And if you were strong, you produced strong Spartan children. They also, right, they had to educate the sons until 7. So you had to have them educated in order to be able to train them, because the men weren't there to do the training. I mean, there was both public school and then private education, and they did both. Dress was unique as well. Athenian women were very covered up, and the Spartan women were free to dress how they wanted. And it was often seen as scandalous in other Greek city-states, the way that they dressed. The Athenians wrote all these things about how aghast they were at how Spartan women dressed. Like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe you allow your women to wear that. They had sleeveless dresses and were shorter, which was, again, super scandalous for the Athenians. The one rule that they had is no jewelry. And this went to the idea of wealth in Sparta. Again, Spartans weren't supposed to showcase more wealth than others in Spartan society. And so the idea of jewelry or looking and showing that you had other additional wealth was seen as a negative. They also were encouraged to share husbands, or I suppose husbands to share wives, with the purpose of childbirth again. If your husband could no longer have kids, you didn't get divorced. You just were encouraged to sleep around to see if you could still produce kids if you could. Kids, they still wanted you to have children. And ultimately it didn't matter, right? Because the only thing that was important about the father, this is connected to that patrilineal structure we saw. The only thing that was important about the father and the mother was that they were Spartan, because you all inherited the same thing. Patrilineal stuff goes to wealth and inheritance. And if you don't have wealth, then that's not super important within that structure. There's interesting things too with early stories of marriage. Now, this was not practiced, but there was an early story that how a man decided on who he wanted to be his wife is that he the man in early story here, right? The man kidnapped the woman and she became his wife. So we'll say, did not practice this. Okay, this was just one of those stories. They may have done it long ago, but within Spartan society that we're looking at, this was not practiced. However, if a woman that was attempted kidnap, being kidnapped, could fight the man off, then she got to pick who she married. So this encouraged them to practice the fighting and wrestling, right? Or at least became that idea of women learning defense, fighting, and wrestling, because that was a way to give them autonomy. Now, whether this actually happened in earlier Spartan society and that's also why then this was encouraged, or it just became a story to explain why women were encouraged to fight and wrestle, it does still showcase the idea that, right, women were not seen as equal in Sparta, but they had so much freedom. If you were going to time travel back into Greece as a woman, Sparta is where you'd want to go, because it would have sucked to be a woman in Athens or anywhere else in Greece. Now, the only other source, we don't have time to look at it, but the Aristotle Spartan women, just to mention it and stuff. This one is interesting because, right, Aristotle is Athenian and he's writing about Spartan women, and he does not like the Spartan women. And so you're getting an Athenian perspective of Spartan women that is definitely clouded with a dislike of them. He blames them for the decline of Sparta. And it talks about their dress and that. But one of the things that he talks about with this is that they were able to own property. If their husband died in battle, that house and land became theirs, and not their son's, because their son was going to get one when he turned 18 or 20 anyway. It became theirs. So women could own property in Sparta. That was super unique as well. So this source is really interesting because it tells us both that also they were able to refuse some early laws with Lycurgus when it changed in Sparta, which he also blames on their downfall, but it shows that women had power and authority in Sparta. So that source I like because it's interesting, because it both gives you the Athenian perspective of Sparta and Spartan women even worse. And if you read other Athenian texts, they complain about the type of food the Spartans had, that the fact that the Spartans were just these big muscular soldiers and all they did was fight and eat blood soup, and oh my gosh, how gross is blood soup, and why is this what people eat? They're actually really funny to read, these Athenian accounts of the Spartans. The Athenians and Spartans were kind of always rivals and both looked at each other with disdain. And yet still a sense of well, we're both Hellenic, but at the same time, you're kind of weird and stupid. And they both thought that of each other. And so you get Aristotle's view of that, where it's Spartans and Spartan women, and I can't believe how scandalous that they let their women do. And they're the reason for Spartans' decline, which they weren't. But then also, because he's talking about the things that they were able to do that he sees as the reason for their decline, it tells us about what women had as of the ability to own property, the authority and power that they had in being able to tell the king, basically, like, we're not going to follow that law, so you can just right on throw that law out, because that ain't happening. And that gives us a view from two perspectives, essentially, in that. So when you're reading that source for the discussion board, pay attention to that dichotomy between what Aristotle thinks is an Athenian about Sparta and what it shows you about Spartan women in the process. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it. We'll look at Athens next, and that will be a good chance to really compare and see how different these social structures were. But hopefully this shows you how Sparta became such a powerhouse society. They didn't have walls in Sparta because no one dared invade them. In the sense of them changing to this structure to fight or to train so that no one would ever overthrow or challenge Sparta, it was super successful. They created, as the 370, manufactured a society based on war. that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years and was such a powerhouse that no one dared challenge them, that they didn't have to have walls. All other Greek city-states had walls to defend themselves. People weren't stupid enough to attack Sparta, because while they were all hoplite soldiers with Phalanx Formation, Sparta was the best land military. They were the best hoplite soldiers because they were professional soldiers that spent every waking hour training and living and eating military. And their focus and purpose that they were told from children is Sparta before the individual. Sparta was more important than yourself. You lived, ate, breathed, died for Sparta. Athens was very individualistic. Me, myself, and I, yay, Athens second, kind of thing. And they celebrated individualism. Athens also became a naval powerhouse, but could not compete with Sparta on land. And so this structure really shows how Sparta became to dominate in that area and why they were one of the major superpowers in Greece over time. We'll come back to them when we talk about the Persian Wars, where both Athens and Sparta work together to fight against the Persians, and then the Peloponnesian Wars when Athens and Sparta go to war against each other. So we will revisit the Spartans after we talk about the Athenians, then we look at the Persian Wars and then the Peloponnesian Wars.